The mid-morning sun, already high, fought its way through the dense canopy of the whispering woods, dappling the forest floor in shifting mosaics of light and shadow. The air was alive with the symphony of the wild, the cheerful, territorial trill of a wren, the distant drumming of a woodpecker against ancient bark, the lazy buzz of unseen insects. A rich, earthy fragrance of pine needles, damp soil, and decaying leaves hung heavy, a perfume that Ranger Dave Holloway had come to associate with home. He moved along the familiar, winding trail with an easy, practiced gait, his boots making little sound on the cushion of fallen leaves. This was his domain, a sprawling section of the state park that felt more like an extension of himself than a place of employment. His eyes, keen and observant, scanned his surroundings with an almost unconscious habit. He noted the fresh deer tracks near the creek, the way a fallen log was slowly surrendering to moss and fungi, the vigorous new growth on a patch of ferns recovering from a dry spell. Today was, by all appearances, a day like any other. The woods breathed around him, a vast living entity, its rhythms predictable and reassuring. Dave's presence was not an intrusion, but a quiet stewardship. He was a guardian, a listener, a man who understood the subtle language of this place. The rustle of leaves that spoke of a passing squirrel, the alarm call of a blue jay that signaled a potential predator, the gentle sigh of the wind through the pines that gave the woods their name. He felt a profound sense of peace here, a belonging that the concrete and noise of the town beyond the park gates could never offer. His uniform was just a formality. His true connection to these woods was etched deeper, in a quiet respect and a lifetime of observation. Dave paused mid-stride, his hand resting on the smooth bark of a birch tree as he surveyed a patch of wildflowers. The familiar chorus of the woods continued around him. The chattering squirrels, the flitting chickadees, the gentle creak of branches swaying in the light breeze. It was all as it should be. Then a new sound pricked his awareness. So faint at first, he almost dismissed it as an insect or a trick of the wind. Peep, peep. It was high-pitched, thin, and repetitive, almost lost in the general hum of the forest. He tilted his head, his brow furrowing slightly. This wasn't the confident, melodic call of a songbird claiming its territory, nor the exploratory chirp of a fledgling testing its voice. This sound was different. It had a fragile, desperate quality to it, a tiny, almost inaudible thread of distress woven into the otherwise harmonious tapestry of the woods. His relaxed demeanor vanished, replaced by a focused alertness. He stood perfectly still, straining his ears, trying to filter out the louder, more obvious sounds. The peep, peep, peep came again, a little clearer this time, a little more insistent. It seemed to be coming from off the main trail, deeper into the undergrowth. Years of experience walking these woods had honed Dave's senses to a fine edge. He knew the difference between the everyday sounds of life and the subtle whispers that signaled something was amiss. This faint, repetitive peeping, almost like a needle stuck on a tiny record, was one such whisper. It was a sound that warranted investigation, a small, urgent plea from somewhere within the green depth of his domain. With a quiet purpose, Dave stepped off the well-worn trail, the soft earth yielding under his boots. He pushed aside a curtain of broad fern fronds, their undersides cool and damp, and ducked under a low-hanging branch, moving with the practiced ease of someone who knew how to navigate the forest's less trodden paths. The faint peep, peep, peep grew marginally louder with each step, drawing him deeper into a sun-dappled clearing dominated by a magnificent, ancient oak. He scanned the forest floor, his gaze sweeping methodically over the leaf litter, the gnarled roots, the patches of moss. His eyes, accustomed to spotting the camouflaged forms of wildlife, searched for the source of the distressed cries. Then he saw it. Nestled amongst the thick, exposed roots at the base of the towering oak, almost indistinguishable from a clump of fallen leaves and shadows, was a tiny, fluffy ball of downy feathers. It was an owlet, a screech owl by the looks of its nascent ear tufts, no bigger than his clenched fist. Its mottled gray and brown plumage offered little protection against the vastness of the forest floor. As he drew closer, the full extent of its plight became heartbreakingly clear. One of its delicate, toothpick-thin legs was twisted at a horribly unnatural angle, bent sharply sideways. It was clearly broken, a devastating injury for such a small, vulnerable creature. The owlet shivered, not just from the cool air of the forest floor, but from fear and pain. Its enormous golden eyes, disproportionately large for its tiny head, were wide and unblinking, staring up at him with a look of pure, innocent terror. Each weak peep it emitted was a tiny, desperate plea for help in a world that had suddenly become terrifying and hostile. Dave's heart clenched. It was a devastating sight, a fragile spark of life brought low, utterly helpless at the foot of the indifferent giant oak. Dave knelt slowly, his movements fluid and unthreatening, careful not to startle the terrified owlet further. The air around the base of the oak felt cooler, the sunlight struggling to penetrate the dense canopy above. He extended a calloused finger, speaking in a low, soothing murmur. "Hey there, little one. Looks like you've had a bit of a tumble." The owlet flinched, but didn't try to move, its broken leg rendering any escape impossible. Its tiny beak opened and closed, emitting another weak peep. Dave's experienced eyes quickly assessed the situation. The break was severe, a compound fracture by the look of it. He knew the grim prognosis for a fledgling grounded with such an injury. Foxes, raccoons, even a passing hawk or crow would make short work of such an easy target. His mind raced through the options. The standard protocol, the by-the-book approach, might be to carefully retrieve the owlet and transport it to the nearest wildlife rehabilitation center. It was a valid choice, one he'd made many times before with injured animals. But rehab centers, for all their good intentions, were stressful environments for wild creatures, especially ones so young and fragile. The success rate for reintroducing such young birds after a long period of human care was not always high. He glanced up at the massive oak, scanning its branches. High above, almost lost in the leaves, he could just make out the darker shape of what looked like a nest cavity. The parents were almost certainly nearby, perhaps watching him even now, their own instincts warring with their fear of the human presence. If he took the owlet away, that natural bond would be severed. His gut, honed by years spent in these woods, by countless observations of its intricate web of life, tugged at him. There was another way, perhaps, a riskier way, one that relied more on nature's resilience than on human intervention, but one that might, just might, offer a better chance for this tiny life to remain truly wild. He glanced up at the massive oak, scanning its branches. High above, almost lost in the leaves, he could just make out the darker shape of what looked like a nest cavity. The parents were almost certainly nearby, perhaps watching him even now, their own instincts warring with their fear of the human presence. If he took the owlet away, that natural bond would be severed. His gut, honed by years spent in these woods, by countless observations of its intricate web of life, tugged at him. There was another way, perhaps, a riskier way, one that relied more on nature's resilience than on human intervention, but one that might, just might, offer a better chance for this tiny life to remain truly wild. He knew the parent owls would be fiercely protective and resourceful if given the opportunity. Leaving the owlet here, as it was a death sentence. Taking it away felt like a different kind of loss. It was a difficult choice, the weight of this fragile life resting squarely on his shoulders. Dave made his decision. It was a gamble, but one he felt compelled to take. He slowly reached for the small, well-worn canvas kit clipped to his belt, its contents familiar and reassuring. He unbuckled the flap and rummaged inside, pushing past a compass, a small first aid kit for humans, and a multi-tool until his fingers closed around what he needed: a small roll of adhesive medical tape and a sharp, clean pocket knife. He looked around the forest floor, his eyes scanning for suitable materials. He selected 2 straight, slender twigs, roughly the length of the owlet's tiny leg, and carefully trimmed them to size with his knife, smoothing any sharp edges. The owlet watched him with its huge, unblinking golden eyes, its body trembling almost imperceptible. "All right, little fella," Dave murmured, his voice gentle and calm. "This might not be very comfortable, but it's for your own good." With infinite care, he cradled the owlet in one large hand, its downy feathers surprisingly soft against his calloused skin. He gently straightened the broken leg as much as he dared, aligning the fractured bones. The owlet let out a series of distressed peeps, but perhaps sensing the lack of aggression in his touch, or simply too weak to resist, it didn't struggle violently. He positioned the tiny twig splints on either side of the injured leg, then, with painstaking precision, began to wrap the medical tape around them, securing the makeshift cast. It was delicate work, his large fingers, usually accustomed to much rougher tasks, now moving with the finesse of a surgeon. When he was done, the tiny leg was immobilized, held straight by the splints. It wasn't a perfect fix, not what a veterinarian could do, but it was the best nature's first aid, applied by a ranger's compassionate hand, could offer in the wild. His next task was to find a safer place for the owlet than the exposed forest floor. He carefully scanned the massive oak tree above. The original nest cavity was far too high, completely inaccessible without specialized climbing gear. But his gaze fell upon a lower branch, thicker than his arm, that forked out about 10 feet from the ground. It was relatively sheltered by a cluster of leaves and offered a decent vantage point. It would have to do. The chosen branch, while lower, still presented a challenge. Dave holstered his knife and carefully tucked the splinted owlet into the deep, secure pocket of his ranger vest, zipping it partway to ensure the tiny creature couldn't tumble out. He then approached the sturdy trunk of the ancient oak. Finding purchase on the rough bark and utilizing lower, sturdier limbs as handholds, he began to climb. It wasn't a difficult ascent for an experienced woodsman, but he moved with extra caution, mindful of his fragile passenger. Reaching the fork in the branch, he settled himself, ensuring he had a stable position. The original nest cavity was still a dizzying height above him, a dark smudge against the leafy canopy. Now for the crucial part. He couldn't just leave the owlet on a bare branch. He scanned the immediate area within reach. With one hand gripping the tree for balance, he used the other to gather materials. He pulled down clusters of dry brown leaves that had collected in nearby crevices, stripped soft moss from the shaded side of the trunk, and gathered wisps of dry grass that had been caught in the branches. Working patiently, he began to weave and press these materials into the V of the fork, shaping them into a small, cup-like depression. He tried to mimic the structure of a natural bird's nest as best he could, creating a shallow, insulated hollow that would offer some protection and stability. It was a rustic, improvised creation, but it was built with care and hope. Once he was satisfied with his handiwork, he carefully unzipped his vest pocket. The owlet, a tiny, warm weight against his chest, blinked up at him with those enormous, luminous eyes. With utmost gentleness, Dave cupped the owlet in his hands and transferred it to the makeshift nest. It settled into the soft lining, looking incredibly small and vulnerable against the backdrop of the vast woods. It let out a soft, questioning peep, then huddled down, its newly splinted leg tucked beneath it. A second chance, Dave thought, looking at the tiny creature in its new, temporary home. A fragile offering of hope perched precariously between the dangers of the forest floor and the safety of its parents' care. Now all he could do was wait and trust. Dave climbed down from the oak with the same quiet care he'd employed on his ascent. Once his boots were firmly on the forest floor, he didn't linger. He knew his continued presence, his human scent, would be the biggest deterrent to the parent owls. They needed to feel safe enough to investigate the strange new nest and their missing fledgling. He retreated a considerable distance, perhaps 50 yards or more, moving silently through the undergrowth until he found a dense thicket of mountain laurel that offered good concealment. From here, with the aid of his binoculars, he had a clear, if somewhat distant, view of the oak tree and the lower branch where the makeshift nest now sat. And so the wait began. The sun, which had been high and bright when he first found the owlet, started its slow, inexorable journey across the afternoon sky. The dappled light shifted, shadows lengthened, and the vibrant greens of the forest began to take on warmer, golden hues. Dave sat patiently, his back against a tree trunk, the binoculars rarely leaving his eyes. He was a statue of stillness, blending into the surrounding woods. The forest went about its business. Squirrels chattered and chased each other through the branches. A doe and her fawn picked their way delicately through a nearby clearing. Birds sang their afternoon songs, but there was no sign of the parent owls. Hours crawled by. The air grew cooler. The sounds of the woods began to change, the daytime chorus giving way to the first tentative chirps of crickets and the rustle of nocturnal creatures beginning to stir. A sliver of doubt, cold and unwelcome, began to creep into Dave's mind. Had he done the right thing? Was the makeshift nest too exposed or too different from their original home? Would they even find it? The owlet was so small, its peeps so weak. He pushed the doubts away, focusing on the image of the tiny, splinted creature, relying on the fierce parental instincts he knew resided in all wild things. But patience, he knew, was often the hardest part of his job. This vigil was a profound test of it. The sun dipped lower, painting the undersides of the leaves in fiery oranges and soft purples. Dusk, the magical, liminal time in the woods, began to settle, blurring the sharp edges of the day into a softer, more mysterious landscape. The air grew still, and the sounds of the forest became more distinct, more intimate. Dave shifted slightly, easing a cramp in his leg, his eyes still glued to the binoculars, his hope beginning to fray around the edges. Then a flicker of movement. Not a squirrel, not a falling leaf. This was different. A shadow, darker than the deepening twilight, detached itself from the higher branches of the ancient oak. It moved with an eerie, almost supernatural silence, its broad wings beating with slow, deliberate strokes that made no sound against the air. A mature screech owl, its silhouette unmistakable even in the fading light, glided through the trees like a phantom. Dave's breath caught in his throat. His heart, which had been a steady, patient drumbeat, gave a sudden lurch. The owl landed gracefully on a branch a few feet away from the makeshift nest. Its head, almost comically large for its body, swiveled nearly a full circle, its enormous, forward-facing eyes scanning its surroundings with intense, predatory focus. It was the picture of silent vigilance. Moments later, another shadow, identical in its silent grace, materialized from the canopy and landed beside the first. The parents. They were here. Hope, which had been flickering like a dying ember, surged back to life within Dave, warm and bright. The sheer majesty of these nocturnal hunters, their effortless command of the twilight woods, was a sight to behold. They were the embodiment of wildness, their instincts honed over millennia, and now those instincts were focused on the small, vulnerable life in the makeshift nest. The two adult owls remained perched for a long moment, their heads swiveling, their large golden eyes like searchlights piercing the gathering gloom. They seemed to be assessing the situation, taking in the unfamiliar structure on the lower branch, perhaps still wary of any lingering human scent. Dave held his breath, his knuckles white where he gripped the binoculars. This was the critical moment. Then, one of the owls, slightly larger than the other, perhaps the female, launched itself from its perch with a silent downbeat of its wings. It flew directly to the edge of the makeshift nest. It paused there, peering intently into the cup of leaves and moss. Dave could just make out the tiny, fluffy head of the owlet within. The parent owl let out a soft, low hoot, a sound entirely different from its hunting calls or territorial warnings. It was a gentle, questioning sound, almost a murmur. It nudged the owlet delicately with its beak. From within the nest, a faint but clear peep peep answered. The parent owl seemed to relax. It ruffled its feathers, then, with a swift movement, it took to the air again. It disappeared into the darker recesses of the woods for a few minutes. Dave watched, his anxiety momentarily returning. But then the owl reappeared, gliding silently back to the makeshift nest. Clutched in its talons was a small, dark shape, a vole or a large insect. With utmost care, the parent owl landed beside the nest again. It tore off a tiny piece of the offering and gently presented it to the owlet. Through his binoculars, Dave could see the owlet eagerly accepting the food, its tiny beak working. The other parent, meanwhile, remained on its nearby perch, a silent, watchful sentinel. A slow, heartfelt smile spread across Dave's face, easing the tension that had been knotted in his shoulders for hours. He let out a long, quiet breath he hadn't even realized he'd been holding. They had found it. They had accepted it. The fragile bridge he had attempted to build between a fallen fledgling and its family had held. Nature's powerful, unbreakable bond had prevailed. Dave watched for a few minutes longer, his heart filled with a quiet, profound satisfaction. He saw the parent owl make another trip, returning with more food for the hungry fledgling. The owlet, clearly invigorated by the meal and the presence of its parent, seemed more alert, its peeps a little stronger. The scene was one of perfect, natural harmony, a small family reunited against the odds. His job here was done. To linger any longer would be an unnecessary intrusion, a disruption to the delicate balance he had helped restore. The parents had taken over, their powerful instincts now fully engaged. They knew best how to care for their young, even in this slightly altered circumstance. With the quiet stealth of a creature born to the woods, Dave slowly, carefully began to back away from his observation post. He moved with infinite caution, avoiding snapping twigs or rustling leaves, melting back into the deepening shadows of the forest. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The image of the parent owl gently feeding its tiny, splinted offspring was seared into his memory. He trusted them. He trusted the wildness of this place, its inherent ability to heal and adapt when given even the slightest chance. His intervention had been a nudge, a helping hand, not a takeover. Now it was time to let nature take its course, to allow the owl family the peace and privacy they needed. As he made his way back towards the main trail, the sounds of the nocturnal forest closing in around him, he felt a deep sense of contentment, the quiet reward of a job done not just by the book, but by the heart. Weeks later, under the warm sun of late spring, Dave Holloway found himself on patrol in the same section of the Whispering Woods. The memory of the tiny, injured owlet and the anxious vigil had softened with time, but it hadn't faded. As he approached the ancient oak, he paused, his senses alert. He didn't go directly to the makeshift nest on the lower branch. He knew better than to disturb the area unnecessarily. Instead, he stood at a respectful distance, listening. The usual symphony of the woods played around him, but he was listening for something specific. And then he heard it. Not the weak, desperate peeps of a fallen fledgling, but a series of stronger, more confident calls. The distinct, slightly raspy vocalizations of a young owl exploring its voice. He scanned the branches of the oak and the surrounding trees. For a moment, he saw nothing. Then, a flicker of movement caught his eye. Higher up, much closer to the original nest cavity, he saw a young owl, noticeably larger than the tiny fluff ball he had rescued. It was perched somewhat unsteadily on a branch, its feathers still retaining some of their juvenile softness, but its golden eyes were bright and alert. As he watched, one of the adult owls glided in silently, a small morsel in its beak, and fed the youngster. The splint, he noted with satisfaction, was long gone, either shed naturally as the leg healed or perhaps even carefully removed by the diligent parents. The owlet even made a short, clumsy hop to an adjacent branch, a fledgling testing its nascent ability to navigate its arboreal world. A quiet smile touched Dave's lips. He didn't need to see more. The proof was there, strong and vital. His gamble, his decision to trust in nature's resilience and the power of parental bonds had paid off. He had intervened, yes, but only just enough, providing a crucial window of opportunity. The rest had been up to the owls themselves. He turned and continued his patrol, the sounds of the woods a little sweeter to his ears that day. The whispering woods still held its secrets, its cycles of life and death, its quiet dramas. But today, its whispers seemed to carry a faint, almost imperceptible note of gratitude, a testament to a ranger's knowledgeable compassion and his unwavering faith in the wild. The lesson, one he'd learned many times, but which always felt fresh and profound, was reaffirmed. Sometimes the greatest care lay not in controlling nature, but in gently enabling its own powerful inherent wisdom.